So I'm very excited to be here tonight to talk about Imprinting Impressionism, the graphic work of Mary Cassatt, Frank Benson, and Childe Hassam. Tonight I'll be presenting the research that I conducted for the essay that I contributed to the exhibition catalog, as Harry mentioned. So the exhibition itself, as you've hopefully all seen by now, really focuses on the similarities and the stylistic influence that Claude Monet had on the American Impressionists as painters. However, when it comes to printmaking, there's a gap. Monet was not interested in printmaking, and the American Impressionists were incredibly interested in it. So tonight I'll be talking a little bit about that gap, how it came to be, and exploring these three specific artists in the title of my talk as a way of creating some connections and drawing some larger conclusions about American Impressionists' involvement with printmaking. A great deal has been written about the prints of each of these artists individually, but when I sat down to prepare my essay for the show, I realized that very little had been done in the way of examining several artists side by side and drawing parallels and larger connections. So that's what I hope to do tonight. So I'll start with discussing the Etching revival movement in France and its influence on the Barbizon school of painters and the French Impressionists. I'll talk about how Monet differed from his French Impressionist peers and from the American Impressionists in his lack of interest in engaging in printmaking with his own hands. And then finally, I'll discuss the Etching revival in England, how it spread to the United States, and how the American Impressionists came under its spell. So, going back a bit, printmaking enjoyed a very long and very storied history as a fine art form, dating all the way back to the 15th century. Artists like the two we see here, both of these works, incidentally, are from the Telfair's permanent collection and are currently on view at the Telfair Academy print exhibit that Harry mentioned. Rembrandt and Dürer were both painters who worked extensively with prints as well, creating original compositions with subjects ranging from biblical subjects, as we see here, to landscapes and portraits, and really a full, broad range of subject matter that they explored. However, by the 19th century, the concept of the fine art print was really on the decline, and prints, for the most part, were used to reproduce works of art in other media, so to reproduce paintings or drawings or other things, not for original works in their own right. However, the dawn of the Etching revival movement in the middle of the 19th century, first in France and then spreading to Britain and the United States, really changed that landscape entirely. And it goes back to the Barbizon school of artists. So roughly around the same time as this Etching revival movement was going on, the Barbizon school of painters was gaining traction. And this is a group of painters very often regarded as precursors to the Impressionists. They were interested in very natural depictions of the landscape that surrounded them, as opposed to mythologically inspired scenes and more idealized scenes of nature. The Barbizon school artists were really grounded in the reality of the landscape, and that's something that, of course, the Impressionists were very influenced by. So of the Barbizon school painters, folks like Corot, Millet, and Daubigny, as we see here, began producing highly finished plates depicting realistic scenes from nature. Other artists, such as Charles Marion, created beautiful and often haunting images that combined realism with elements of fantasy and generated even more interest in printmaking, both in France and abroad. Marion's images largely take on the subject of his beloved home city of Paris, so we see urban subject matter as opposed to the natural landscapes of some of the other Barbizon artists that we looked at. We also see, I mentioned elements of fantasy. In the image on the left, you can see here that he shows soldiers mounted on flying fish. These were the sorts of visions that he actually had visions like this, and he portrayed them in his artwork in surprising ways, because at first glance it looks like a very literal, lifelike depiction of a scene that the artist might have witnessed. So inspired by the potential for innovative artistic expression in printmaking, many of the French Impressionists would go on to create prints, with major contributions from artists like Edgar Degas, probably most notably, but also Félix Bracquemond, Camille Pissarro, and Jean-François Raffaelli. There were other worthwhile efforts put forth by painters who just dabbled in printmaking, but, exercised that a few times in their career at least, such as Alfred Sisley, Paul Cézanne, Renoir, Berthe Morisot, and others. So really you can see the big name missing from this list is Monet. Here we have this Degas print, and Degas was known for these very experimental prints that would utilize different printmaking media on top of one another on the same plate, and then reworking the plate, and really pushing the limits of what could be achieved visually with a print. Here's a great work by Camille Pizarro that shows a similar sort of experimental approach. You have this rapid, loose image on the plate, and it has a deliberately unfinished appearance, which is something we'll see again and again further on in my talk. So Monet was really the only major French Impressionist who never engaged in any sort of printmaking with his own two hands. He did do some things, however. He allowed reproductive etchings and wood engravings of his paintings to be made by other artists. He created drawings for publication in the popular media, and we see an example of that here. He used a technique called guillotage, which was at the time a relatively new process, and it was ideal for commercial applications because it allowed a very accurate print to be made in very high quantities. So it was great for things like magazines or book illustrations. And so the way this works is that Monet would take a special type of coated paper and create a drawing on it after one of his own paintings in all cases that we know of. And then that drawing could then be reduced down and printed line for line in the popular media in a very large quantity. So this is a great example of an original painting by Monet at the top right. On the left side, we have the drawing that Monet created after his own painting, and then the bottom right, we have the final guillotage that resulted and that was published in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts. And actually that issue of the Gazette des Beaux-Arts is contained in the exhibition in the print section in a little case in the back. So you can see it's just a magazine. The final result isn't a fine art etching that would have been collected by a major collector or anything like that. Monet made some adjustments to his composition in order to adapt his painting for publication in the media. You can see right off the bat that he has really altered the prominence of the cathedral and the town in the background. They're much larger in the drawing than they appear relatively in the painting. And he's also evened out the skyline. Look at the tallest mast of that ship in the foreground is now in the drawing equal with the spire of the cathedral in the background, whereas in the painting, the mast is much taller than the spire. So he made some adjustments. He, of course, you had to whittle down the composition because in this type of reproduction, only pure black and white would reproduce. You were not able to really translate any subtle shades of gray or anything other than a pure black and white. And of course, you also lose a lot of contrast in from the drawing to the final print. So he created the drawings with that in mind as well. Now, the other type of printmaking that Monet did engage with, and again, this was not with his own two hands, but he did collaborate with a lithographer named William Thornley, who was French-born of British parentage, and he allowed Thornley to create a limited edition portfolio of lithographs after Monet's paintings. And here we see a nice example side by side of one of Monet's paintings and then the lithograph that Thornley created inspired by it. So you see this is classified as a print by William Thornley after Claude Monet, again underscoring the point that Monet did not create prints with his own two hands. So this is a project that Monet had some artistic voice in. He helped select the works that would be reproduced in the portfolio. He is believed to have weighed in on things like color choice and the type of paper used, but it really was not truly his project. So this is the very limited scope in which Monet did participate in printmaking. So you might ask what were his motivations for even engaging in projects like this if he wasn't going to go all in and create prints with his own hands? Well, his motivations appear to stem from a desire to have more control over how his work was reproduced in the media, as well as to promote his exhibitions and help market his paintings and promote the sale of his paintings in his exhibitions. He certainly had that image and that aura of the genius artist, but he was a practical man on many levels, and he certainly was a savvy marketer and thought a great deal about the marketing of his work and the sale of his work. There's a great comment from him about his thoughts on marketing, talking about a poorly attended exhibition of his in 1883. He wrote a letter to the gallerist complaining, "And we'd be blind not to see the truth staring us in the face, not to recognize that the exhibition was ill-prepared and poorly advertised. It is necessary at all costs to secure in advance the cooperation of the press, since even intelligent art lovers are more or less responsive to the noise made by the newspapers." That's a great quote. So he's thinking about these sorts of things, even as he is the genius artist off in his studio. So while the French etching revival was very influential on the French Impressionists and, of course, on the Barbizon school painters, at the same time, it also trickled across the Channel to England, where it was very influential to a man named Francis Seymour Hayden. Now, Hayden was an acclaimed surgeon. He was a collector of prints, a student of old master prints, and an accomplished etcher in his own right, and we see one of his works here. He is credited with helping to legitimize etching as a fine art form in Great Britain, and spread that popularity to the United States through his writings that can only be described as fervent. He was really passionate about prints, about the merits of the print. He also helped to establish the Society of Painter Etchers in 1880, and he also conducted an extensive lecture tour here in the United States from 1882 to 1883, where we know a lot of the American Impressionist artists, most of whom were fairly young at this time, some were even students, were exposed to Hayden's lectures during that lecture tour. So he really helped to promote printmaking on that tour. Hayden, not least of his contributions to the world of prints, is the fact that he was the brother-in-law of James Abbott McNeil Whistler. And Hayden is crediting with encouraging Whistler to first take up etching and to study etching and to really embrace printmaking. And of course, Whistler would go on to become one of the most famous printmakers of all time. Although he spent his career primarily in England, his reputation and influence certainly carried over to the United States, as it continues to do today. Here we have two, although Whistler was not included as a major subject in my paper, he was not actually included in the exhibition at the time of my writing of the paper. His work was added in a little later. But I've included here the two images that are in the exhibition by Whistler, and they demonstrate the very loose, unfinished quality of his etchings and his lithographs, in this case both lithographs, that was so scandalous and shocking at the time. On the left we have Little Waterloo Bridge. So this is a view of Waterloo Bridge in London, the same subject as one of the Monet paintings that we have in the show. And like that painting by Monet, we can see that the bridge seems to sort of disappear into the background as if that London fog is just enveloping it. And on the right, the image of the Thames, it's incredibly tonal and subtle in its composition, and the layered bands of the composition, to me, really call into mind the influence of Japanese printmaking, which was something very much on Whistler's mind through most of his career. So back to Hayden. When he came to the United States on his etching tour, on his etching lecture tour, he found a lot of active groups already springing up in the United States devoted to gathering printmakers together, advancing printmaking in communities from the East Coast to the Midwest. These include the New York Etching Club, which had been founded in 1877, and then in the 1880s, similar organizations would be founded in Boston, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and Brooklyn. So there was a real movement underfoot at this time. The first generation of participants in the American etching revival included folks like Stephen Parrish, Charles A. Platt, Henry Ferrer, R. Swain Gifford, and as we see here, Mary Nemo Moran. Now, none of these are household names. They are to me, but I guess my household is different. But these are not artists who have really left a huge legacy as far as their reputations. And these were artists who worked almost exclusively with landscape as their subject, subject, and they were interested in capturing realistic, luminous views of their surroundings. They were also printmakers, first and foremost, not painters who just dabbled in printmaking on the side. But as an American school of printmaking became more and more established, greater numbers of artists were inspired to take up the etching needle, including many of the leading American Impressionist painters. And so I'll consider this phenomenon of the growing popularity of printmaking among American artists by now looking at the 3 American Impressionist painters that I discussed in the title of this talk and their involvement with printmaking. And at the end, I'll conclude by drawing some connections and some pointing out some similarities and some general observations that result in looking at all 3 of these artists together. So first we have Mary Cassatt, who is certainly very well known as a painter, but is also known as an extremely prolific printmaker. She is known to have produced around 250 different prints, beginning in 1879, which was also the first year that she exhibited with the French Impressionists. And of course, Cassatt was the only American to do so, to exhibit with that group of French Impressionists in Paris. And she continued to work in printmaking through about 1910. The works in her print production mainly echo the subject matter that she tended to lean towards in her paintings. So we have a lot of women and children, we have a lot of domestic scenes, and interior scenes of women in domestic environments. Now, Cassatt had no interest in printmaking in the early years of her career. She regarded it as a lesser branch of art. And this is probably because she was a student at the Pennsylvania Academy in the 1860s, the first half of the 1860s. And this was still at a point when the etching revival had not really taken a hold yet in the United States. So etching was largely looked down on as a lesser form of art making. Also, at the Pennsylvania Academy, the curriculum at the time focused very heavily on the mastery of drawing techniques before allowing students to move on to painting. And this repetition and this drudgery, as Cassatt perceived it, made Cassatt very impatient, and she would go on to sort of carry that with her and would not develop a sincere interest in printmaking until she was exposed to the really innovative work by her French colleagues like Edgar Degas, and saw the ways that they were utilizing printmaking in really groundbreaking and dazzlingly inventive ways. So she approached her prints like a painter in many cases, combining several different printmaking techniques onto a single plate, trying to really push the limits of what you could accomplish with a print. These 2 works here show not just the sort of subject matter for which she is best known, but also that characteristic effect of a deliberately unfinished image. So by leaving large areas of the composition blank, she's giving those spaces a great deal of weight and forcing the eye to look where she wants your eye to look. In the image on the left, that's really to focus in on the mother and child and that lovely reflection of them in the mirror. And in the image on the right, it's to look, of course, again at the figures, and your eye sort of travels around the composition from the mother's face to the arm to the toddler's face and the other arm pointing, and there's this beautiful sort of movement from the composition. It's a very spare composition. So in her color prints, her stylistic approach was very heavily influenced by the widespread popularity of Japanese prints at that time. Cassatt had visited an exhibition in Paris in 1890 of Japanese prints, and the subject matter and the style of them was extremely moving to her and would be very influential. There was a prominent critic at the time, a man named Christian Brinton, who noted of her color prints in 1906, saying about Cassatt, "The simplicity of her contour and the clarity of her 2 or more flat tones give these chance episodes of domestic existence a charm as rare as it is engaging." So she received a warm critical reception for this type of work fairly early on. I also thought it was important to include here an image of the type of print that Cassatt would have seen at that Japanese print exhibition in Paris. And you can certainly see the large flat areas of color and pattern, the close-up vantage point, and the sort of cropped composition. These are all things that are echoed in her own color print work. So So the next artist we'll look at tonight is Frank Weston Benson. Now, Benson was a prominent painter in the Boston School of Impressionism, and he dabbled in etching when he was just a student at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts from 1880 to 1883, but then he largely abandoned it until much, much later in his career. And in fact, it would be more than about 30 years later, when he was in his 50s, that he embraced printmaking again, and he did so with great enthusiasm and gusto. He'd go on to become one of the most prolific printmakers among the American Impressionists, creating more than 350 prints, mainly etchings and dry points, with just a couple of known lithographs. And he did all this between 1914 through 1942, so nearly to the end of his life and really to the end of his working years. And he earned himself a reputation as the Dean of American Etchers. So unlike Cassatt, Benson's choice of subject matter showed a marked difference from the paintings that had made him famous. While his paintings are best known for the subjects of women and children in gardens, people outdoors, on boats, bright, colorful scenes of people in outdoor settings. For printmaking, he tended to select sporting subjects. So here we've got some fishermen, hunters were another favorite subject of his, and oftentimes he would do plate after plate after plate of ducks, flying geese, flying ducks, all sorts of combinations of birds, birds on a simple background of sky, which could be a really prosaic subject in another artist's hand. But he really had a knack for translating sunlight and atmosphere into the black and white medium of etching. So he also, although he's really well known as this sporting artist, and in fact he's credited with really inventing the genre of the sporting print, he also did experiment every now and then with different sorts of subject matter. So the two prints we see right now are included in the exhibition, but for contrast, I wanted to show you two others that are not included in the exhibition, much rarer images, much less typical of his general style, which is why works like this were not included in the show. We only had I believe three prints by Benson in total in the exhibition, so felt it was important to really represent the style and subject matter for which he's best known. But tonight I wanted to show you these two works to show how great potential he had for exploring and experimenting with different types of subjects. Here, the work on the left is titled Candlelight. So he's spelling out for you very plainly that the subject of this print is not the woman standing before the mirror, but rather it's the effect of the candlelight as it illuminates the figure, it casts the shadows in the background, the shadows on her back, and of course how it illuminates the mirror in front of her. He's also interested in light and reflections in the work Dark Pool on the right, where it's almost an abstract composition. For Benson, this is very abstract, and really the focus of this work is on the reflection of the standing birds in the water. But for Benson, I also wanted to include, this is the third image by him that is in the show. And this print is really a great example of how he can effectively translate sunlight and atmosphere into the black and white medium. When you talk about the idea of an impressionist print, at first it can sound contradictory. If any of you were at my lecture a few weeks ago, I talked a lot about color and light and brush strokes and layered paint and sunlight and shadows, and all of those things seem like they would be difficult to render in black and white. But when we talk about the Impressionists' interest in capturing atmosphere and the vagaries of clouds and sunlight and atmosphere at a specific moment of time, this print does a beautiful job of doing just that. The cross-hatching in the sky contrasting with the really glassy blank area of the water, and then the darkly silhouetted figure standing in front of it, all evoke a particular moment in time and the unique atmosphere that pervaded the scene that the artist observed. And there was a critic at the time who stated that Benson is not only selective, he is the delineator of light and air. His birds are enveloped in atmosphere. They never float in a vacuum or against an impalpable sky. And although we don't have any birds here, I think the idea of an impalpable sky, this is a palpable sky if there ever was one, very densely rendered. So the third American Impressionist artist who was also a prolific printmaker that we'll talk about tonight was Childe Hassam, who produced 380 known etchings and dry points, as well as 45 known lithographs. So you'll see already all three of these artists were very prolific when it came to their printmaking. Like Benson, Hassam dabbled in printmaking very early in his career, in his student years in the 1880s and in Paris, actually. And then he turned away from the medium altogether for decades. Also, like Benson, he took it up again much later in his career, and he made his public debut as an etcher in late 1915 with an exhibition of prints he had created just that summer before. So he had returned to printmaking a little bit in the late 1910s and then really embraced it in that summer of 1915. Within weeks of taking up the etching needle again, he was producing prints that looked as if they were the result of years and years of study. He was really uncannily talented at it. He was very much influenced and encouraged by his close friend and an artist who was a fellow founder of the group of the 10 American painters, J. Alden Weir. Now, Weir was no longer actively making prints himself at this time. He had worked in print for only a brief period from the late 1880s through the early 1890s, but his time working as a printmaker had made an indelible impact on him. And Hassam took Weir's encouragement to heart and really embraced with a fervor this new change of medium for himself. So his subjects, Hassam's subjects in his prints included the landscape, contemporary urban views like the one we see here, the figure in the landscape, and domestic interiors, all of which closely parallel the paintings, the oil paintings that made him famous and that his career was really founded upon. An example, well, before I move on to that, this image here, Hassam was not one to leave his plates unfinished, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. His plates were kind of surprisingly detailed and finished compared with his American Impressionist peers. But this particular work, I have to point out that beautiful empty area on the side of the building that we see on the left-hand side of the screen, and how that quiet area really amplifies the buzz of activity and movement that we see in the figures on the right-hand side of the plate. But a great example of Hassam taking on the same subject in a print as a painting is seen in the exhibition. So the little inset image is the famous painting from the Telfair's collection, Avenue of the Allies, which is included in the show. And then on the left, we have a lithograph that he did a year later and gave the same title to, Avenue of the Allies. And it shows how one artist went about taking on the same subject in a very different medium. So although there's no color in the lithograph, you can look at these two works and kind of see that they're by the same artist, right? You have the same sort of crawling, ant-like figures at the bottom, the really dynamic flags draping the architecture, and just the general bustle of this urban view of New York. And Hassam also did a lot of depictions of an unspoiled landscape or village scene or the figure in the landscape, like the two that we see here. And here's where you really see how Hassam's style of printmaking differed dramatically from that of many of his contemporaries. His plates were full of marks from edge to edge. Just as a painting would be covered with brush strokes over the whole surface most of the time, his etching plates were just covered with marks. And this is something that we don't see in folks like Whistler or the other artists associated with American Impressionism who were engaged in printmaking. Those artists were sometimes criticized as creating unfinished works, and they were praised. When they were praised, it was for the beauty of the line and the spare line, and you hear a lot about that describing prints of this era. But Hassam's style was dramatically different. He created these really complex webs on his compositions, and in fact, a contemporary critic used a wonderful turn of phrase. He was praising the unique, complete aspect of Hassam's prints and said that he conveyed a wonderfully delicate fabric of line and light and shade. And I like that line so much, I'm going to say it again. Hassam conveyed a wonderfully delicate fabric of line and light and shade. And that description could very easily be applied to either one of the two images that we see here on the screen in front of us. So in conclusion, after considering the printmaking output of Benson, Cassatt, and Hassam, an important similarity emerges. All three of these artists began their serious engagement with printmaking only after achieving considerable success in oil painting. This raises the question of why these painters, at the height of their fame, would turn to a new, technically challenging medium of art making with which they had almost no experience. And as discussed previously, it can be guessed that Monet's engagement with printmaking, the limited engagement that he did have, stemmed from his desire to control how his work was represented in the media and to better promote his paintings. And I think some of these practical, publicity-driven concerns can definitely be attributed to the Americans as well. Prints, of course, exist in multiples. Their prices have always been much more affordable than oil paintings, and those combined factors allowed prints to be disseminated far more broadly and to a much more diverse group of collectors than oil paintings ever could be. And Mary Cassatt is known to have explicitly called this out in her discussion of prints and the reasons that she was attracted to making prints. And she goes on to say that nothing will inspire a taste for art more than the possibility of having it in the home. I should like to feel that amateurs in America could have an example of my work, a print or an etching, for a few dollars. That is what they do in France. It is not left to the rich alone to buy art. The people, even the poor, have taste and buy according to their means. And here they can always find something they can afford. So she's very clear in stating that for her, printmaking accomplished a separate goal, and a fairly lofty goal, of not just spreading the awareness of her work, but also enabling a broader cross range of people to acquire and to live with art in their homes every day. This is a noble effort on her part. And this point is echoed in an article in the New York Times in 1917 that was describing the newly formed group of the Painter-Gravers of America. And this is a group that Childe Hassam was a founding chairman of. And so the writer comments, the print is more in keeping with the democratic tendencies of today. It can be bought within the means of a greater number. So you can see this idea of a print being democratic and accessible to all was something that was certainly in the language and in the discussion of these artists even in their day. Now, commercially, we know that Childe Hassam's prints were not a huge success. He had a great comment once that was probably a thinly veiled shot at his colleague, Frank Benson. Hassam said, "Not doing ducks and dogs, my prints are rarely very successful." Poor Hassam did not sell his prints very well, but Benson did, and Benson continues to sell his prints very well, probably because they appeal to not just fans of art, but fans of hunting and sporting as well. But Benson and Cassatt were successful in selling their prints, but even so, it would take the sale of many, many prints to equal the sale of even one painting by these artists who were very well regarded and in high demand at this point in their careers. So if they weren't making prints to make money, what created that sustained energy? I mean, each of these artists made hundreds and hundreds of prints. And I think another reason that we can't ignore is the fact that as the American school of printmaking became more and more established during the final decades of the 19th century and in the first decades of the 20th century, it was so overwhelming that it was difficult, if not impossible, for professional artists to ignore it. Every artist seemed to be taking their hand at printmaking, and it was incredibly prevalent. In 1915, a critic said, or lamented might be a better word, "One benefit in a fashion is that everybody follows it. There is no chance for talent to lie fallow or remain obscure. Everybody is tested. Nobody escapes." Kind of giving light to the fact that it came from being fairly obscure and a medium that was looked down upon to being something that nobody could escape. And perhaps even more importantly, printmaking provided a means of original artistic expression, as well as a true challenge to artists who, most likely, had long ago mastered the use of paintbrush and paints to create their work. It required the artist to master new and unfamiliar artistic tools, often complicated chemical processes involved in creating the plates, to understand the sensitive workings of a printing press, whether they did the printing themselves or outsourced it to a professional printer, as well well as to consider the varied visual effects that could be achieved through the use of antique papers, the reworking of a plate through multiple states, or the way in which excess ink was wiped from a plate before being printed. And I feel that this challenge and the opportunity it provided for a new mode of artistic expression captivated Cassatt, Benson, and Hassam, and resulted in unique bodies of printed work that are a testament to the artistic possibilities of printmaking. Thank you.